What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Born as a prisoner, died as a shadow queen. The meteoric rise of Madame de Maintenon. From poached truffles and bird stomach to Marie Antoinette's personal chocolate chef, Versailles' excessively frivolous foods are legendary. However, you might not be familiar with Françoise d'Aubagne, the woman who was Louis XIV's secret wife and ruled Versailles. Although she was born in a prison, she went on to become one of the world's most powerful women and is better known as Madame de Maintenon. The battles waged by Louis XIV are famous, but the behind-the-scenes battles between his mistresses could be just as cutthroat. After the king's mistress helped Madame de Maintenon get a job and a title, Maintenon drove her out of Versailles and stabbed her in the back so he could get a crown. Françoise learned social climbing from Parisian philosophers, and she used her marriage to an impotent older man to rocket herself onto the intellectual scene. Françoise secretly married the Sun King and ruled alongside him for more than 3 decades after becoming the governess of the king's illegitimate children and receiving the title Marquise de Maintenon. How did the impoverished daughter of a man jailed for murder and treason become Queen of France in all but name? Find out by reading on. By snatching Louis XIV, Madame de Maintenon rose from prison to palace. Louis XIV was known for marrying his lovers. "They're all good enough for him provided they're women," his sister-in-law once said. Also, the king wasn't picky. Peasants, gardeners' daughters, chambermaids, ladies of quality. All women were fair game to the Sun King. So, how did a senior woman, whom Louis called unbearable when they first met, eventually win the king's heart and become the occult Queen of France? Using her intelligence, connections, and clever strategy, Madame de Maintenon rose from prison to palace, such as when she lied to her own benefactor to get closer to the Sun King. She was also successful in achieving one of the most meteoric rises in history, from a prison cell to Versailles, through her efforts. Françoise was born in a prison, so she could only go uphill from there. Since Françoise d'Aubagne, who became known as Madame de Maintenon later on, was born in a prison, things could only get worse from there. Constant d'Aubagne, Françoise's career criminal father, was in prison when she was born in November 1635. Constant's list of crimes included murder, kidnapping, treason, and debt. He was a gambler, a counterfeiter, and he participated in a failed rebellion against the throne. In a duel, he also killed a man. For his long list of crimes, Constant was disowned and disinherited by his father, a famous poet, so he was a pauper and an outcast. While in jail, Constant married Jeanne de Cartelhac, the jailer's daughter, and had 3 children with her. Françoise might have had a noble name at birth, but she was born with absolutely nothing and treated as a social outcast from the start. The fact that she eventually rose to the position of Queen of France is even more remarkable. As a young orphan, Françoise was forced to marry a much older man. After her birth in prison, Françoise d'Aubagne had a difficult childhood. Once her father got out of prison in 1643, when Françoise was 7, he took his family to the West Indies, where he disappeared and died a few years later. Françoise returned to France as a pauper with her mother. She was forced to beg on the street for food. Françoise's mother died when she was only 16, leaving her an orphan. Françoise was sent to live with the writer Paul Seurat, who was 25 years older than the teenager, because her strict aunt, who was responsible for raising the girl, wanted to get rid of her. Knowing how poor Françoise was, Seurat became fond of her and offered to marry her or pay for her dowry to enter a convent. In 1652, when Françoise was just 17, the couple got married. With their union, she became Madame Seurat. It was not a love match. Françoise later said, "I preferred to marry him rather than a convent." Maintenon was introduced to salon culture by her first husband, an impotent satirist. When the teenaged Françoise became Madame Seurat, all of Paris ridiculed the match. Even Françoise herself reportedly burst into tears the first time she met her future husband. He was used to that kind of reaction and responded, "My body, it's true, is most irregular. Pregnant women aren't even allowed to look at me." Even though he was already in his 40s, Paul Seurat was a paralyzed and helpless author of burlesque verses. A crippling disease rendered his body practically useless, stunted his life, despite some success for his work. As a teenage bride, Madame Scarrat had to serve as Paul's nurse in a tiny apartment in Paris. However, the Scarrats hosted a salon for Parisian intellectuals who challenged the French establishment, which was a positive outcome of their marriage. Philosophers, essayists, and writers gathered to discuss concepts and criticize religious fanaticism. The salon soon built a reputation as the meeting place for all the most cultured people from the court, and all the clever people in Paris. It was here that Madame Scarrat met the people who would change her life. As a 25-year-old widow, Madame Scarrat found herself broke yet again. At 25, Madame Scarrat became a widow when her husband died. Paul Scarrat left his wife in an even worse position than she'd been during their marriage. She inherited nothing but a mountain of debt. Madame Scarrat wanted to continue her pursuit of philosophy and literature, but once again she found herself destitute. But she was young and beautiful, and she had built contacts with wealthy Parisians through her salon. One of those contacts was the wildly popular and influential Madame de Montespan. The king's mistress helped Madame Scarrat earn a position at the royal court. One of Queen Marie-Thérese's ladies-in-waiting, Madame de Montespan was Louis XIV's favorite mistress. Her blue eyes, blonde hair, voluptuous figure, as well as her stinging wit, had earned her the nickname Athénais. And even though she was married to the Marquis de Montespan, that didn't stop the king from falling for her. As the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan had riches and prestige, and the power to help her impoverished friend Madame Scarrat. In 1669, Montespan invited Madame Scarrat to serve as the governess for the king's illegitimate children she'd borne him. Because Athénais was married to another man, the king's children were in a delicate position. Louis could not publicly recognize them, and yet everyone knew he was their father. It was an important role for Madame Scarrat to take on. Little did Montespan know, however, that she was helping the woman who would one day replace her. In the process of becoming the ideal governess, Madame Scarrat earned the title. The job of governess for a king's illegitimate children was difficult. Madame Scarrat raised the growing brood of children in a private house in Paris, where Louis XIV would come visit in secret. Madame Scarrat was 36 years old at the time of their first encounter, making her 3 years older than the king. Louis's first impression of Scarrat was that she was unbearable because she played the role of a respectable, prim governess so well. But the king noticed when Scarrat helped the king's son, the Duc du Maine, recover from a serious illness in 1674. He made the governess the Marquise de Maintenon by giving her the lands and title of Maintenon. For the first time in her life, Madame de Maintenon felt secure. She had a noble title, she was financially secure, and she was welcomed by the courtiers at Versailles. While stabbing her friend in the back, Madame de Maintenon plotted to advance the queen, earning the king's admiration. Marie-Therese of Austria, Louis's wife, had to endure the fact that he spent a lot of time with his mistresses. Marie-Therese's arranged marriage to Louis was an attempt to end the wars between France and Spain because she spent her childhood in Madrid. The king didn't seem to care much for his queen during their long marriage, despite occasional attempts to treat her with dignity. In point of fact, the king is said to have laughed when the queen passed away, saying, "This is the first time she's caused me any grief." However, Madame de Maintenon saw an opening when the king's affair with Madame de Montespan ended. Rather than trying to take over the role of the king's mistress, Maintenon advised the Sun King to reconcile with his wife. Montespan, who had invited Maintenon to court and given her illegitimate children to the governess, was forced to leave Versailles as a result of Françoise's move. Furthermore, Madame de Maintenon ended up taking over the queen's duties after her death in 1683. In a secret ceremony, Madame de Maintenon became the next queen of France 3 months after the queen died. The king and Madame de Maintenon's relationship quickly became more formal. The Archbishop of Paris married Louis and Maintenon on October 9 of the same year that Queen Marie-Therese passed away on July 9, 1683. The ceremony was private, and the marriage was never publicly announced, in part because Madame de Maintenon came from a modest background. Even though Madame de Maintenon played the role for the next 32 years, she would not officially be crowned Queen of France. Madame de Maintenon's meteoric rise earned her enemies at Versailles. They saw her as a greedy, ambitious woman, and called her La Scarra behind her back. Madame de Montespan wrote that Maintenon took possession of an extremely sumptuous apartment at Versailles, where she rode in the king's carriage and was even called Majesty by some. Maintenon devoted herself to a school for girls in her capacity as secret queen. Madame de Maintenon devoted a significant amount of her attention to the establishment of a school for disadvantaged girls after marrying the King of France. The Maison Royale de Saint Louis, also known as Saint Cyr, was set up to help poor nobles' daughters get an education, which was where young Françoise d'Aubagne had found herself. Louis XIV paid for the school when he paid a formal visit in 1690 with his secret wife. The school, which was designed to educate 250 girls, was run by Maintenon herself. Religion, reading, writing, mathematics, Latin, and the arts were all part of the curriculum. Under Maintenon's direction, Saint Cyr concentrated on providing girls with a practical education that would prepare them for adulthood. Maintenon was blamed for Versailles' boring years. Madame de Maintenon was almost exactly the opposite of the typical free-spending monarch as a secret queen. Maintenon, on the other hand, was regarded as morally demanding, and she was already in her late 40s when she wed the king. It is said that Madame de Maintenon had a lot of power over the king and helped him be more religious and pious. In fact, some people thought that her reign as secret queen was strict and boring. Louis XIV courtiers resented the change from the free-spirited, party-loving early years. Madame de Maintenon was described as prudish, not exactly what the courtiers wanted in a monarch, so naturally she was blamed for the change. Was she a cowardly con artist? So, she was very good. Madame de Maintenon was held accountable for Louis XIV's later failures, even during her lifetime. She was called a devious schemer who only pretended to be devout to trick the aging monarch. Even today, some textbooks portray her as an overambitious, greedy, and evil woman. Is Madame de Maintenon a ruthless con artist, a compassionate nurse, or a pampered governess? Her foes referred to her in a variety of ways and attributed her actions to the aging Sun King. When Louis finally passed away in 1715, Madame de Maintenon was almost 80 years old. 3 years later, she passed away and was buried at Saint Cyr. Although Madame de Maintenon's ambition and intelligence saved her from a life of poverty and ended with her portrait on the walls of Versailles, not a bad job for a girl born in prison, history may remember her as a schemer.